Okay. Um, all right. Well, thank you for joining me tonight as I talk a bit about my research. This is you may notice I changed the title slightly, but this is kind of drawn from some of the early chapters in my forthcoming book, which, as Jim mentioned, is called "Let the Oppressed Go Free: The Revolutionary Generation of American Abolitionists." And it looks at kind of the late colonial period through the American Revolution and focuses on the rise of anti-slavery. So let's begin. The key question that I'm trying to answer in this book manuscript is why did so many and how many, as part of the question, white colonists turn against slavery during the Revolution? In 1776, all 13 mainland colonies, well, more if you count Canada and Florida, all of them allowed slavery. Slavery is legal everywhere, including all the northern colonies. But then by the end of the Revolution, or within just a few years afterwards, slavery had been abolished or was being abolished in much of the North. And by 1804, every northern state would have begun the abolition of slavery. And so, yeah, I'm looking at kind of why that happens. And the traditional explanations of what other scholars previously have written about is kind of, they've noted that during the colonial period, there was anti-slavery sentiment, but they emphasized that it was mainly religious and that it were inspired by religion and was not very effective. And this part of the reason why, according to just one kind of common, this one popular book, it says that arguments based on Christian principles face considerable hurdles, not least of which was the Bible's apparent sanction of servitude in many instances. And I'll talk more about this later, about how, yes, the Bible in some ways could be used to justify slavery. And so many historians have said because of that, religious critiques of slavery were not actually very influential. Instead, they highlight that it's only during the Revolution that you have the rise of anti-slavery, and they attribute this to new secular ideas about natural rights, because much of the American Revolution, they're complaining about threats to their liberty, things like that, and their natural rights. And the notion is that the Declaration of Independence and similar documents, by emphasizing natural rights, inspired a new level of anti-slavery sentiment that proved much more effective than the earlier religious critique. Though I should mention that some recent scholars have actually kind of downplayed the extent of anti-slavery and kind of highlighted instead kind of racism and the limits of anti-slavery. But in general, the most common view is that religious-based anti-slavery was not very effective, but then when it was inspired by the revolutionary ideology of natural rights, that's when it took more hold. My kind of intervention in this scholarly debate is to emphasize the continued centrality of the religious impulse, perhaps only among a minority of white colonists, but a very influential minority, and that I argue that they, along with enslaved people of color, kind of together actually promoted all and achieved the achievements that were made, the abolition of slavery in the North and undermining it in some ways in the South. And much of this has to do with what I call Providentialism and Biblicism, or anti-slavery and anti-slavery Providentialism and anti-slavery Biblicism in my case. And Providentialism, what I mean by that is essentially the view that many people had at the time, some still do, that God directly intervenes in human affairs and rewards and punishes societies and nations based on their collective sins or righteousness. You can't send a nation to the afterlife, so you reward it or punish it on earth. And then Biblicism is the notion that the Bible is the perfect guide for morality and that it should be interpreted literally, and whatever it says is okay is therefore okay, and whatever it says is bad is therefore bad. And so the debate, of course, is that I'm interested in is, was slavery acceptable or not? And then an important kind of documentary source that I give a lot of attention to that many historians have kind of overlooked, I think, is these fast day proclamations, which were very common at the time. Whenever there's a kind of a a crisis, whether it's a famine caused by a drought or an earthquake or a war or a smallpox epidemic, the different colonies would hold fast days where the colonial government would declare a public fast, a day of humiliation and prayer, and the people would confess their sins and promise to reform with the hope that God would then end whatever the crisis was. And I think that a lot of this kind of these fast days and the sermons that went along with it, that's actually what I believe inspired a lot of anti-slavery sentiment, as I'll explain later on. All right, let's start out though by looking at this question of biblicism. Does the Bible tolerate slavery or not? Because yeah, when people justified slavery, it was almost always by the Bible. Slavery, of course, it's inspired by people's greed, economic self-interest, but to justify it, they would use the Bible, usually the Old Testament. And the Old Testament made a clear distinction between servitude and slavery. And here we have the passage that dealt with the servitude of fellow Israelites or Hebrews, the fellow Jews. And basically it says that whenever a fellow Hebrew becomes so impoverished that they're willing to sell themselves into slavery, they can be a servant for up to 6 years, and in the 7th year they shall be freed and given some payment. Essentially, it's a form of indentured servitude. And this is why in the colonies, indentured servitude, at least for white Christians, was limited to 7 years. And you see below, this is a law from Massachusetts in 1641. They're actually, Virginia is an older colony, and they have both indentured servants and enslaved Africans earlier than Massachusetts, but Massachusetts was actually the first colony to codify these practices in their written law. And so this law, clearly inspired by Deuteronomy, says that, yeah, after 7 years, servants will be freed and they will not be sent away empty. Though it does say that if they misbehave, their period of servitude can be extended. So just like Hebrew servants couldn't be held in servitude for more than 6 or 7 years, same thing with white Christians. On the other hand, the Bible in Leviticus and several other places does allow the enslavement of heathens, people who were not Israelite or Jewish or Hebrew at the time. And yeah, again, it reiterates that your fellow Israelites cannot be enslaved. And it says, because I, meaning God, brought them out of the land of Egypt, they shall not be sold on bondsmen, because they are the Lord's servants. On the other hand, the heathen that are round about you, of them shall ye buy bondmen and bondmaids. And so yeah, the Israelites were allowed to hold non-Israelites in perpetual bondage, and it seems to have been hereditary, because Leviticus goes on to say that they that are begat in your land, meaning the children, they shall be an inheritance for your own children. So it seems to be perpetual hereditary slavery was allowed for the people they would consider heathen. And again, in the Massachusetts law, we see the same type of thing. They begin by saying there shall never be any bond slavery, villanage, which is another kind of form of servitude or captivity amongst us, unless, and then there's 3 big exceptions: lawful captives taken in just wars, strangers that are willingly sell themselves or are sold to us, and then down below it says those who are judged thereto by authority. In practice, what this meant was that lawful captives taken in just wars, those are Native Americans. So beginning with the Pequot War in 1636-37, they started enslaving Native Americans that were taken captive during the war. That increased during King Philip's War and other subsequent wars. The strangers that are sold to us, those were Africans. Often they would capture Native Americans, export them to the Caribbean, and trade them for African slaves, bring them into Massachusetts. And then those who were judged thereto by authority could be, yes, they did have white slaves who were criminals. In the 1640s, we had numerous cases in Massachusetts, for example, where arsonists or rapists were condemned to slavery. So normally a white person could not be enslaved or in servitude more than 6 or 7 years, but if they committed some heinous crime, then they could be enslaved. Meanwhile, non-Christians, Native Americans and Africans, they could be subjected to slavery if they were captured in war or imported as slaves. And Massachusetts, as I said, is the first colony to adopt these laws, but other colonies follow similar practice. And there are some ambiguities in this. One of them is, well, what happens if an enslaved African becomes Christian? Then can they be enslaved? And yeah, this law doesn't explicitly say that slavery will be hereditary. It says it'll follow the same laws from the law of God established in Israel, and there it seemed that slavery was hereditary. So in practice, it seems that in Massachusetts, they continued to enslave Black Christians and their children, but they never clarified that by law. Places like Virginia, they did explicitly in 1662, they said that yes, slavery is hereditary, even if the father is white, as long as the mother was enslaved, the child is a slave. And they say that baptism and conversion to Christianity do not affect the status of slavery. So although the Israelites would not enslave fellow Israelites, white Christians felt they could enslave Black Christians, at least in, yeah, most of the colonies, it seems. All right, and so yeah, so most slaveholders use the Bible, use the Old Testament to justify slavery. Now I want to talk a little bit about providentialism, which again, this notion that God rewards and punishes nations. And yeah, these are very common to have fast days, proclamations of fast days during wars. And I've just given an example here. One of these pamphlets is from Oliver Cromwell when he's the Lord Protector, essentially the dictator in England after they killed Charles I in the English Civil War. And yeah, he issues numerous fast days while he's in charge. Sometimes it's because of famines, other times it's because of wars. And in one of the cases when they're fighting a war against Spain, Cromwell describes Spain as the rod that God is using to punish them. And Cromwell essentially says that the English nation is full of sinners and God is angry, and God is using the Spanish army to punish us, to chastise us. And he points to some recent Spanish victories. And he says the victories on Spain's behalf, that doesn't show that God favors Spain, but God punishes his beloved people, the English in this case, just as in the Hebrew Bible, God punished his chosen people, the Israelites, by using the Babylonians or the Egyptians as his rod to chastise them for their sins. He says, we are God's chosen people, and the evil Catholics in his view are not, but God is using the Catholics, the Spanish, as the rod with which to chastise the English for their sins. Again, just as God had used the Babylonians and the Egyptians to chastise the Israelites. And yeah, so he says that we need to pray for God's forgiveness and that he will aid us and help us defeat the Spanish. And yeah, these were mandated in England, and they have them in the colonies too. Now, some people spoke out against these, including George Fox, who is the founder of the Society of Friends, also known as the Quakers. And the Quakers are just kind of forming as a group in the 1640s and 50s. So they're quite young at this point in terms of a religious sect. But George Fox issues numerous pamphlets denouncing Cromwell's calls for fast days. And you might be able to see on the cover of one of this pamphlet, he quotes Isaiah 58:6, and his subtitle is also taken from that. In Isaiah 58:6, Isaiah is one of the prophets telling the Israelites why essentially bad things seem to be happening to them, even though they're God's chosen people, even though they're praying to God and having fast days and things like that. And God speaks through Isaiah and says that God is essentially ignoring your prayers because you are only pretending to keep a fast. It's a superficial fast, and you're just doing it for self-interested reasons. You can use the fist of wickedness to smite your enemies. You're just praying for the wrong reasons. And what Isaiah 58:6 goes on to say, that the type of fast, the type of worship that God really wants is to loose the bands of wickedness, to let the oppressed go free, to break the yoke and undo the heavy burdens, to help other people. Now, George Fox does not yet connect this to a call for anti-slavery. When he says let the oppressed go free, he seems to be meaning he doesn't like the way Cromwell is oppressing Quakers and other religious dissenters in England. Later generations of Quaker abolitionists will use that same biblical line to condemn slavery itself. But the point is that just, throughout the colonial period, these days of fasting and prayer are quite common. Quakers, on the other hand, dismiss them as kind of superficial. And over time, you do have more and more religious-based critique of slavery, though most of it is calls for ameliorating slavery, making it less harsh, and calling for conversion, more attempts to convert the heathen Africans to Christianity, because they complain that these Africans are being enslaved, and but what's even worse is they're being brought to a Christian land, but not taught about Christianity. They're just being worked to death and being denied. They're taken out of this. These evangelical Christians view Africa as this dark, ignorant continent, and they're in some ways okay with enslaving the inhabitants there, but they say only if slavery is a means to an end, and that ends needs to be converting them to Christianity. That, they say, will justify their enslavement. All sorts of religious leaders: George Fox, Richard Baxter. Fox, again, is a Quaker. Richard Baxter is a Puritan. Morgan Godwin is an Anglican. Cotton Mather, a famous Puritan in Boston. George Whitefield, a Methodist itinerant, part of the Great Awakening. All of these people kind of make these arguments in different ways, saying that we have a moral duty to convert our slaves, and then the providentialist part comes in when they say, and if we don't, God will punish us for the sins, for our failure to convert them. So they're not saying necessarily that God is punishing us for the sin of slavery, but the sin of failing to convert the heathen slaves. Cotton Mather, for example, he writes numerous books, pamphlets, actually justifying slavery, but says it's only justified if we convert them. And he says our failure to convert them is why we're having so many wars and droughts and famines. He says that that God has a controversy with us on for our conduct with relation to the African slaves. And again, it's not enslaving them, but it's failing to Christianize them. And during King William's War in the 1690s and Queen Anne's War in the early 1700s, he says that God is using the Spanish and the Indians and the French as rods with which to chastise the colonists, that the reason we're being attacked is because God is angry with us, and he is using our enemies to chastise us, to punish us for our sins. And George Whitefield says the same thing. And he advocates for the introduction of slavery in Georgia. Georgia was the only colony that initially banned slavery. Whitefield helps convince them to allow slavery in the 1740s. Yet at the same time, he's also warning slaveholders that their failure to convert their slaves is angering God. He says, God has a quarrel with you for your abuse and cruelty to the poor Negroes. And he points to the Stono Rebellion of enslaved people in South Carolina. It says that God inspired that rebellion. He talks about the beginning of a new war, the War of Jenkins' Ear, a new war with Spain, is saying this is, again, this is showing that God is angry with us. And so this is a common theme, that bad things happen, and people trying to explain why, they often blame it on the actions of slaveholders, not slaveholding itself, but their failure to do much to convert their slaves to Christianity. A small number of white colonists go farther and say that slavery itself can never be justified by the Bible. And William Edmondson, a Quaker, an English Quaker, but he travels in in the American colonies when he writes his anti-slavery letters in 1676. He is one of the first to make this argument, and then Samuel Sewall, who's better known, a famous judge in New England and Massachusetts. He was one of the judges in the Salem witch trials, but he also uses the Bible to condemn slavery. And both of these two men, it's interesting, they use the same passage from the New Testament. They use Ephesians 2:11 to 14, and they essentially say that yes, the Old Testament did sanction slavery. However, we Christians live not under those old dispensations, those old rules that God established in the time of Moses, but rather the new gospel dispensation from Jesus Christ. And they say that when Jesus died, his life, and teachings, and death destroyed the old partition wall between the Hebrews and the heathen that had allowed the Hebrews to enslave the heathen, and says that therefore Christians cannot enslave anyone. Because they quote from this letter from Paul to the Ephesians, and Paul is a Jewish convert to Christianity, but he's writing to some Gentiles, some heathen who had converted to Christianity. And he says that, remember that in the past you were Gentiles, you were aliens, strangers from the Jewish covenants. And again, those aliens and strangers, the heathen, they were the ones who could be enslaved according to the Old Testament. But Paul goes on to say, but now in Jesus Christ, you who are sometimes far off are made nigh by the blood of Christ. He hath broken down the middle wall of partition between us. And what Edmondson and Sewall argue is that, yes, because Jesus destroyed this partition wall, the Old Testament justification for slavery are no longer valid and cannot be used. Among Puritans, Samuel Sewall had only limited influence, but these arguments proved much more influential among Quakers. And so over the next 60 or 70 years from the time of Edmondson, you have more and more Quaker abolitionists writing anti-slavery pamphlets. And they're all making these similar arguments, saying that slavery might have been justified in the Old Testament, but it is a sin under the New Testament because Christ destroyed the old partition wall. And they warn also of divine retribution. For example, let's see, one of them, like inside, they cite passages such as Revelations 13:10, which says that he that leadeth into captivity shall be led into captivity. Elihu Coleman of Quaker from New England writes that God knows best the rod that is suitable to chastise us with. And others warn that the day of vengeance is to come unless they proclaim liberty to the captives and free their enslaved people. And so they're making both biblicist arguments, saying that properly understood, slavery is a sinful violation of the Bible, unchristian, and also providentialist warnings that we've already been experiencing bad wars, droughts, things like that, and worse is to come as God will punish us for our sins. And this brings us now to the French and Indian War. And this is going to be the decisive war for Quakers. Other people will take a little longer. But the French and Indian War, of course, were in the biggest war up to that point. Spawns the 7 Years' War in Europe. And one of the kind of the most devastating parts of it for the colonists is that it often involved Native Americans raiding frontier settlements and taking white colonists as captive and holding them captive. You'd had this before, Mary Rowlandson and other famous kind of Indian captivity narratives. We have even more of this during the French and Indian War. And as in with these previous wars, you have days of fasting and prayer. I mean, King George II, he calls for days of fasting and prayer in England, and in America too. The individual colonies have their own fast day proclamations. And many of these, especially those in New England and Pennsylvania, specifically point to Indian captivity as a form of God punishing us. So this one from the governor of Rhode Island, talks about the chastising hand of heaven, who has permitted the barbarous and cruel savages of the wilderness to spoil and destroy their borders and to murder their young men and carry off their sons and daughters into the most calamitous captivity. So they're saying, yeah, this Indian captivity, this is God chastising us for our sins. Now, these fast day proclamations, they don't point to slavery as the sin. They point to drunkenness, Sabbath breaking, things like that, more what we might consider kind of more mundane sins in some ways. But they say this is what's angering God. The Quakers, on the other hand, basically determined that no, the principal sin that is causing God's righteous anger against the colonies is the sin of slaveholding. And in 1758, the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, which kind of sets policies for most of the Quakers in America, not all of them, but for most of them, they disavow slavery in 1758. And they connect it directly to the ongoing war. They say that they talk about the present circumstances, meaning the war in this province and the others, that by permission of divine providence has been visited with the desolating calamities of war and bloodshed. And they talk about how many of our fellow subjects are suffering in captivity. So they're referring to this Indian captivity. And they basically say this is God's way of punishing us for the sin of slavery, which violates the golden rule. And the golden rule, Matthew 7:12, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The Quakers often link that with Matthew 7:2, which is judge not lest ye be judged. With what measure ye mete to others, it shall be meted back to you. So the way you treat others will be treated back to you. So if you're good, you'll be rewarded. If you punish others, they will punish you. And yeah, they say that now God is meting back to us our punishment. We enslaved non-white people, the Africans, and now other non-white people, the Indians, are enslaving us. They view this as a very kind of poetic form of divine justice, their own sins being turned against them. And so in 1758, they call for all Quakers. They say we must follow the injunction to do the golden rule, to do unto others as we would have them do unto us. And then they say this means that all friends who have any slaves should set them at liberty, making a Christian provision of them according to their ages. And so, yeah, the Quakers begin gradually freeing their slaves in 1758, and basically within 18 years, they have to have freed all their slaves, so they get disowned. And as the war starts to kind of go better for the colonists, some Quakers begin to think, oh, well, maybe we've done enough. Maybe we don't need to free our slaves. One of the leading Quaker abolitionists, John Woolman, he then publishes a pamphlet, the second part of it. He published one several years earlier, but now he publishes a second one, Consideration on the Keeping of Negroes, part the second, in 1762. And in it, he draws an analogy with Jeremiah 34. In the book of Jeremiah, the Israelites are under siege from the Babylonians, and they proclaim liberty to all of their Hebrew servants. They say, well, normally, yeah, you'd have to serve for years more in your indenture, but we're going to free you now if you help us fight off the Babylonians. And they arm their servants. They fight off the Babylonians. And then once have established peace again, the former masters force these manumitted Hebrew servants back into servitude. And then God gets angry and he punishes them. He says, I shall give you liberty to the sword, to the famine, and to the pestilence. So he releases all these warfare, disease, and famine upon them, and the Babylonians come back and sack the city of Judah and enslave the Hebrews. And in Woolman's reading, he says, this is because, yeah, they made a promise to end oppression, and then they broke their promise and God punished them. We need to follow through on our promise to end slavery, or else God will punish us, just as he had punished the Israelites when they failed to follow through. And after the French and Indian War, that of course is the period when Parliament begins passing new taxes on the colonists. And the patriots, the people who resist these taxes, routinely describe taxation without representation as slavery. Their proclamations constantly talk about Britain's attempt to reduce us to slaves. And yeah, many historians have written that kind of this criticism, this is part of, along with the natural rights ideas, is what kind of awakened people to turn against slavery. But I think also very important is again, this notion of providentialism and fast days, because throughout the imperial crisis of the 1760s, the colonies routinely had fast days where they prayed to God to forgive our sins and to repeal the Stamp Act, to repeal the townshend duties, whatever tax it was, they prayed for God's forgiveness and to remove it. On the other hand, abolitionists kept pointing out that this taxation that you call slavery is likely God's way of punishing you, chastising you for the sin of slavery. God is trying to open your eyes to these sins. They go back to Revelations 13:10. He that leadeth into captivity shall be led into captivity. For the Quakers during the French and Indian War, they saw that happen with Indian captivity. Now they're saying, look, it's happening again. Slaveholders are now complaining about taxation as slavery. Well, they're being punished by God. And yeah, many of these white abolitionists begin saying that if we want God to hear our prayers and to cause Parliament to start treating us fairly again, we need to follow the injunction of 58:6 Isaiah. We need to let the oppressed go free. That is what will please God. And a lot of these anti-slavery writings are timed to coincide with the different fast days in different colonies. And African Americans also adopt this language. Phyllis Wheatley, who I have a picture of here, she's the famous basically a girl when she starts writing poems. She's African, enslaved when she's about 8 years old and brought to America, educated and eventually freed. And she publishes a book of poems in 1773 and then writes some anti-slavery letters later that get published in newspapers. And in it, she describes the American patriots as the modern Egyptians. She says that they are kind of hypocritically praying God to deliver them from the British. Yet they themselves are the modern Egyptians who are oppressing the Africans. And she says that God will liberate us Africans in his own time. So kind of reversing the way the patriots they're praying for God's deliverance. She says, no, God is going to deliver the Africans first. And during the war, you also have more and more of this. After the war breaks out, you have more and more people saying that, yeah, this warfare is now God's rod chastising us. Right after Bunker Hill, one of the earliest big battles of the Revolution, an early poem by a Reverend Elisha Rich, I believe, in Massachusetts. He writes this poem, publishes it in multiple editions, and most of it is kind of celebrating the valor of the soldiers. Yet he also says that this war is God's punishment for us because we have enslaved our fellow creatures. And he says, we will not win until we let all of our neighbors free. And he's talking about, he says, everyone in a human form must be given their freedom. And it's during the war, more and more anti-slavery pamphlets are published. And again, they often coincide with fast day proclamations, and newspaper essays also do. And they say that God is not going to support us, not going to let us win the war until we let the oppressed go free. And it's in this context that Massachusetts abolishes slavery through a series of judicial court rulings. Between 1773 and 1783, they essentially end slavery in the state of Massachusetts. Pennsylvania is the first state to begin abolishing slavery through legislative means, through a gradual abolition law. And again, this is one of those things historians often point out that, oh, this came after the Declaration of Independence and they were just inspired by natural rights ideas. If you look at the text of the bill, they do talk about natural rights, but they explicitly frame it as this is the way that we can show our gratitude to God for delivering us. Because in 1777, the British had conquered Philadelphia, the nation's capital at the time. And it was occupied by the British for 9 months. And then the French became our allies, and they arrived. and that's when the British retreated. And it was right after that that legislators began proposing this abolition law. It took 2 years to pass because of the distractions of the war, but it was framed specifically as God has given us a taste of slavery by letting the British kind of conquer us, but then he delivered us from their oppression, and we now feel a duty to show our gratitude by extending the blessings of liberty to those in our power. And so they begin abolishing slavery. Now they do it very gradually. They free just the next generation of slaves, but still they begin the process of abolishing slavery, of letting the oppressed go free, connecting it to a way to show their gratitude to God. And other states soon followed this example. So in 1784, Connecticut, Rhode Island, they adopt similar laws. And so by the end of the war, slavery has kind of been dealt a mortal blow in the North. Of course, in the South, it's much more economically important, and they're not able to overcome it there. But in the North, it is dealt this mortal wound, and it's not simply natural rights. It's this notion that the war itself and the taxes, for decades, Quakers and other anti-slavery Christians have been arguing that God views slavery as a sin, and that it is a sin, it has been ever since the time of Jesus, and God is going to punish us for us. And they view the revolution not as this kind of decisive break, but it's just one more war that they're viewing as God's chastising means to punish the colonists for the sin of slavery, to awaken them to it, and to inspire them to reform it, which again, many of them do, though sadly not throughout the nation. But that this religious impulse remained completely central. All right, thank you. And if anybody has questions,